The Economist.
In London, this is The Economist. Why are humans moved by certain paintings, faces, or landscapes? How do we perceive beauty, and why do we enjoy art? These are some of the tricky questions that neuroscientists are working to answer. I'm Emily Bobrow, The Economist's online culture editor, and with me on the line to discuss some of the theories of these neuroscientists is Anjan Chatterjee, a professor of neurology at the University of Pennsylvania and the author of a new book called The Aesthetic Brain, about how humans evolved to desire beauty and enjoy art. Anjan, we like to say that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but you seem to imply that our appreciation of beauty is actually hardwired into our brains. Do I have this right?
I think you have that right for the most part. It turns out that a lot of things that we regard as beautiful tend to be common both across different cultures and even, perhaps more surprisingly, even among infants before they've been exposed to different kinds of cultural influences. So specifically in the context of faces, which you might regard as the paradigmatic object that we regard as beautiful or not beautiful, infants will look at faces that adults think of as beautiful more so than faces that are not as beautiful. So there is a sense that a lot of what we respond to in beauty seems to be hardwired, which doesn't mean that it isn't then further influenced or modified by culture, by exposure, by education, and so on.
So what are you defining as beauty?
Beauty is one of those things that most people have strong intuitions about, but then when you try to define it, turns out to be not so easy. As an operational definition, I would start with the idea that beauty is a property or a set of properties and objects that typically give us pleasure. And once you start with that definition, things become interesting because you might say that people can be beautiful, places can be beautiful, and even mathematical theorems can be beautiful. And so then the question becomes, what is it about those properties? Are there a common set, or are there different properties that all end up giving us a kind of pleasure that we then regard as beautiful?
So are you measuring our appreciation of beauty just through the pleasure sensors in the brain? I mean, how do we measure our appreciation of beauty?
So the general idea is that you can do behavioral studies, which is you show people different kinds of objects that you experimentally manipulate, and you find out what people tend to like, what they claim to like, what they find interesting, the kinds of images that move them. You can also do this in an fMRI scanner and look at their neural activity in response to these kinds of objects. And that gives us some sense of the neural signatures of when people are experiencing something that they feel is beautiful. So to give you an example, we had done an experiment a few years ago looking at people's responses to different kinds of faces. And what we were able to show that in parts of the visual cortex, that areas that are specialized to respond to faces in general tended to have more activity as the faces became more beautiful. It looks like there are three parameters that seem to contribute to which faces people think are beautiful. So symmetry is one. A side note to that is it can't be exactly symmetric. If it's perfectly symmetric, you get a weird kind of effect that people find artificial. A second parameter is what is sometimes called averaging of faces. And what that means is that if you have, say, 16 faces of varying degrees of attractiveness, and by average I mean, for example, the distance between the two eyes, if it's averaged across the 16 people, the averaged face typically looks more attractive than any of the individual faces. And both symmetry and averaging applies to both men and women. What is different are the kind of features that make men's and women's faces different, which has been referred to as sexual dimorphism. So the effects of testosterone on men's faces and of estrogen on women's faces typically are what heterosexual people find more attractive in faces of the opposite gender. So with men, tends to be the kind of square jaw, somewhat heavy brow. For women, it tends to be large eyes, full lips, small chins, high cheekbones, many of the features that are typically associated with a more youthful appearance.
That's an interesting explanation of why we find some faces more attractive than others. But in your book, you mentioned that you prefer the abstract prints of Miro over the work of some other artists. How do we form our preferences about art?
Yeah, so that is harder to talk about in some ways. A strong finding in empirical aesthetics is people's preference for abstract art seems to correlate with how much exposure to art they've had. So if you have people that are relatively naive with respect to art, judge art, most people like representational art, and fewer people like abstract art. And then the other big piece is the way meaning and again knowledge plays into our aesthetic experiences. Here's a simple example. If you think about Impressionist paintings, when they first came on the scene in the late 19th century, most people didn't like them. They were considered garish. They certainly didn't make it into the mainstream. Whereas now, Impressionist paintings are regarded as probably the most preferred paintings by the general population. And in 150 years, it's clear that our brains haven't changed, but something has changed in how we look at them. So that's where I think exposure, education, and culture enters into the scene and changes how we look at things and changes our pleasure in things, which includes abstract art.
What about landscapes? Why do we find some places more attractive than others?
There, the argument is that when we look at the kinds of landscapes that people find attractive, they typically have certain kinds of features that all lead to the suggestion of safety as well as nourishment. And the kind of adaptive arguments have been that our ancestors in the Pleistocene that found pleasure in those kinds of places were also more likely to survive. Being safe and having sources of nourishment meant that they would have more progeny over time, and that predisposition towards liking those kinds of places ends up accumulating in the population. And there, the evolutionary argument is one more of natural selection rather than sexual selection. And so, if we think about our instincts towards beauty, it looks like there are a collection of different kinds of adaptive instincts that all contribute to this notion of beauty, which is why I think even though we all have, or most people have strong intuitions about what's beautiful, I've sort of referred to beauty as being a mongrel concept, which is that there are these different adaptive reasons that contribute to why we have these strong responses to objects that we regard as beautiful.
That's interesting, and in some ways it leads to my final question. Do you think there's something reductive in viewing our understanding and appreciation of beauty only through the lens of survival?
I think if it was only that and nothing more, it would be reductive, and reductive in a sort of uninteresting sense. What I would argue is that lies at the core and then is further modified by our exposure, by culture, and so on. To give you an example, there is this notion called the peak shift principle, which is that if you have a set of characteristics in any kind of object that evokes a response, and in this case we're interested in the characteristics that evoke a pleasure response in the context of beauty. If you can isolate those parameters and then exaggerate them, you get more of a response. So that's the peak shift. So take that basic observation that has been observed in birds and in most organisms in which it's been looked at, and apply that to culture. And what you find is that, for example, the kind of makeup that people use, and if you look at the cosmetic surgery industry, which at least in the US is quite a massive operation, where typically in a year there are more than 12 million surgical procedures done. All of those procedures typically enhance the same parameters that we were talking about with respect to facial beauty. So here you have a situation where culture is operating on these parameters that I think we have evolved to react to and applying this peak shift principle to exaggerate the responses to them. So going back to your original question, I think if you were to just restrict the idea that beauty is determined by these adaptive instinctual parameters, it could be reductive. On the other hand, if you say that that's the starting point and then you ask questions of how culture interacts with that, how culture moderates that, then it's not quite so reductive.
That was Anjan Chatterjee talking to us from the University of Pennsylvania, where he's a professor of neuroscience. His new book is called The Aesthetic Brain. In London, this is The Economist.
The Economist.